Welcome to a bonus episode of the Blooms Barnacles podcast. I am here today with a fantastic guest. Zoe Patterson is a PhD candidate at Trinity College, Dublin in the School of English. I had the pleasure of meeting Zoe when I was in Glasgow this summer at the International James Joyce Symposium. I've already forgotten the number. I talked to Zoe quite a bit then and got to see her give a talk related to her thesis, which I think is going to be very much of interest to all of our listeners because I think it's how most of us kind of met each other. And I guess I'll start by saying, welcome to Blooms and Barnacles. We're so happy to have you here. And now to get into business, your research is about Joycean community groups, reading groups, things of that nature. Tell me a little bit about your research.
Yeah, so, like you just said, my research is on Joycean communities. So that's specifically looking at non-academic Joycean communities. So those are things like reading groups, book clubs, but also things like Blooms Day, or, social media groups such as like Facebook groups where people discuss Joyce, that kind of stuff. So really any forum in which people engage with Joyce in a non-academic setting. There is a bit of a caveat to that because I say non-academic, but in reality, when you engage with these reading groups, or, you go to a Blooms Day event, or you're even on like r/James Joyce, there are academics there often. And if they're not there mingling with the non-academic readers, then the non-academic readers are often using academic resources, whether that's books, articles, podcasting, things produced by academics, either for other academics or for non-academic readers. So I say non-academic reading groups, but it's not quite non-academic. So I'm looking at a few different things with these groups. First of all, I'm looking at sort of why does Joyce's work lend itself so well to being read in a group. So obviously book clubs are just a massive thing everywhere in the modern age. And most book clubs, read a wide variety of writers. And it's usually you go home, read a book on your own, and then you go discuss it, and then you pick a new book, that kind of thing. But there are also book clubs where, they only read one writer. And these kinds of clubs exist for multiple writers, but they exist in a very high concentration for Joyce. I don't know the numbers on it, but I'd say it's far more likely you're gonna find a larger concentration of Joyce reading groups than you are, say, like Dickens reading groups. Not that there aren't Dickens reading groups out there, but there are just a lot of Joyce groups. This is also an international phenomenon. So people assume that like all of this would be going on in Ireland, Joyce both being Irish and, his books being very, very about Dublin. But you can actually find Joyce reading groups everywhere, mostly in the Anglophone world, but also outside of it as well. So this is sort of a worldwide thing. And I'm also interested in the unique approach that these reading groups often take. Oftentimes, like I said, with book clubs, you read the book on your own and then you show up and discuss it. Sometimes people will do that with Joyce groups, but what often ends up happening instead is groups get together and they read the text aloud to one another and discuss it right after doing that kind of thing. So it's a bit of a different format to the conventional book club. So I'm looking at why Joyce for this sort of mode of reading, like what about Joyce really lends itself to this? And I'm looking at what these groups sort of do for non-academic readers. So something I'm looking at a lot is Joycean difficulty and why we perceive Joyce as difficult, that kind of thing. And how do these groups sort of demonstrate that? How do they provide support for that kind of thing? How do we decide that a text is difficult? Why is Joyce difficult? And I'm also looking at the relationship between these communities and the Joycean academic community, because obviously there is a Joyce scholarly community and they discuss the texts in certain ways that are sometimes quite different from the way non-academic groups discuss the texts, but there's also a lot of overlap. The two camps sort of have an interesting, complex relationship where they overlap a lot, but there is tension there. So I'm also sort of looking at that and thinking about how we can improve that relationship in the areas where it could use improvement, sort of how both groups can benefit one another, that kind of thing. So sorry, that was very rambly.
No,
but
it's great.
Kind of looking at a lot of different avenues with this.
Yeah. I'll start with kind of just a basic overview question, what is the average Joyce community like in terms of demographics, gender, age, nationality, location, things like that? Is there an average Joyce group or?
Yes and no. So Joyce groups, in terms of nationality, like I said before, these groups are everywhere, but they tend to be more concentrated in the Anglophone world. So there are a lot in Ireland, there are a lot in the UK, there are a lot in the US. There tends to be that Anglophone bias, even though it's not an exact thing. In terms of other demographics, this is not a universal, but from what I've noticed, the average age of the groups tends to be a bit older. A lot of that I personally think is because older people tend to be retired, have more time for things like Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake. People who are younger, especially if they're in college, in grad school, whatever, there's also the phenomenon of university reading groups where it's like outside of a class, but it's still within a university setting. Younger people may be drawn more to that just because of where they are in life. Definitely trends older, but that's not an absolute. In terms of gender, it really varies by group. I've noticed I haven't seen a lot of groups that are like very noticeably dominated by women, but I've seen some that are definitely have been a bit more male, but then a lot tend to have a good mix in terms of gender. Am I forgetting any big demographic areas there? Yeah, so it really varies. But I would definitely say trends towards native English speakers, trends toward older generally. So yeah.
I have to say, none of that is surprising to me in the least. Cool. I'm very interested in this tension between the non-academic and the academic groups. Do you think that the kind of general makeup of the academic population, is it pretty similar to the kind of hobbyist groups or enthusiast groups? Does the typical professional Joycean look pretty similar to the hobbyist Joycean, or is there a difference there?
I'd say so. I'd say, like, obviously there's a bit of a difference in the age demographics, just because if you're doing this as a career, you're going to kind of have people of all ages. So there's less of a trend towards older, but there still are a lot of older scholars, that kind of thing. Yeah, I'd say I found the demographics to be somewhat similar. Definitely more young people, but again, I think that's just because, like, in terms of being in the Joycean world, there just are more young people who are, like, doing their PhD or early career scholars versus young people who are at that age who have the time to just do a Joyce reading group just because. Somewhat similar but not exact.
Okay. So I'm very interested in your question of what is it about Joyce that lends itself to this type of reading group, because it will surprise no one to know I have been in a multitude of reading groups. The first time the only time I first read Twilight because it was the book for a reading group. But yeah, like that when you're gonna read the book at home and then you come and meet in the library and fight with the other women about Edward and Bella and things like that. So what has always marked the difference in any Ulysses group I've been in, whether it was back in Portland or Sweeney's, is you sit and you read the text and then you talk about the text. And, I'm a former English teacher at this stage, and that's something you really debate, pedagogically. It's like, do you have the students read out loud in class? Do you have them read and then at home and just discuss? And it seems like there's something about reading it, and I'm guessing it's just because the text is quite challenging. I'm avoiding saying difficult, but it is challenging. Like, it's not Twilight. There's a lot more words in there.
Yeah.
What is it in, I certainly have some guesses and opinions, but I want to know what you've found talking to all these different groups. What is it that makes them choose to reading out loud really dominate those spaces?
Yeah, so I think it's a combination of a few different things. I think the first thing, which is, something, an element of Joyce's style that's been written about quite a lot, is the musicality of it, the orality of it. He's even, cueing us to this with the Homeric bent of Ulysses. He's really drawing on sort of that ancient oral tradition of literature in his style of writing, combined with, his focus on musicality. It's one of those styles that just doesn't resonate fully until you hear it. It's like poetry in that way. I think if you were to have a poetry reading group, you'd have to do the same thing. You can't just, So I think there's that, and I think people who are intimidated by either Ulysses or Finnegan's Wake, because I'm looking sort of at groups for both, because those are the really popular texts with groups. People who are intimidated by it, who just see it and just see like this block of text that looks scary. When they hear it, it brings it to life. It gets people excited about it. Hearing people read it, hearing people act it, makes it fun for people. So I think that's a big one. I think as well, to less so the reading aloud and more, the reading collectively, is the encyclopedic nature of both Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake. Joyce basically, with both those books, more so with The Wake, but with Ulysses as well, basically wrote two unsolvable novels. Kind of a tangent, but I will bring it back. There's sort of an infinite amount of puzzle solving you can do with both books. Infinite amount of rabbit holes you can go down. I think a lot of people, they go into Joyce thinking that like, I need to solve as much of it as possible, and that's the whole point. But I think at least part of the point of both of those books is that you have to be comfortable with not knowing everything, not understanding everything. And it's not just being comfortable with it, it's finding it fun.